and I represent the NCAA. And because the NCAA is the defendant in the case, I get to talk to you after you heard from Mr. McNair's attorney. And it's going to be like that throughout the trial. And that means that by the time I get up to talk to you, you will have already heard their side of the story. And after hearing that presentation, some of you may be wondering, what am I going to say in response to all of that? Well, at bottom, I'm going to say two things. First, we do agree about something. The process that led to the findings against Mr. McNair was not perfect. You heard that mistakes were made in interview questions. And you saw that some people wrote things in private emails to their friends and colleagues that they shouldn't have written. We are going to take responsibility for those mistakes throughout this trial. But the second thing I have to say in response is that there is a lot the counsel left unsaid. You will see that there is a lot of evidence in this case. And it's my job to explain the rest of it. Get into things that they didn't discuss, or when they were put up an email or a document, just focus on a line or two. It's my job to focus on the rest of it, to show you the whole picture. And it's also my job to point out when there is a gap in the evidence. And you will find that at really important times in this case, there is simply no evidence to connect two dots. And in the place of that evidence, counsel is just going to ask you to assume. And hope that by repeating something to you, in argument and in questions, that you will eventually assume it to be the case. But as Judge Shallow will instruct you, nothing that we say in these arguments is evidence. And our questions are not evidence. What you hear from that witness stand, what you see in the documents, what you see in the tape depositions, that's all evidence. And once you hear all of that evidence, you will understand why Mr. McNair should not win this case. And once you hear all of that, you will understand why he is not entitled to the millions of dollars that he is seeking from the NCAA. Now, I'm not alone in presenting this case to you. And so I just want to take a quick moment to introduce Corey Bell. Corey, can you stand up? And Rakesh Kawar. They are going to help me present the evidence over the course of these weeks. They're going to take turns sitting up here with me because we only have 2 chairs. They will present some of the evidence to you. And also with us are representatives of our client. And today we have Naima Stevenson. Naima, could you stand up, please? I told you a little bit about Ms. Stevenson in jury selection. She has worked for the NCAA for more than 10 years. And she was actually involved in some of the matters that you're going to hear about in this case. And either she or one of her colleagues from the NCAA will be here every single day of the trial. So, where I'd like to begin is by talking to you about what is the NCAA. I think counsel may have described it as the people who make the rules. But the evidence will show that's not exactly right. the NCAA is just the collection of all the colleges and universities. They created the NCAA, and the reason they did that is they wanted to make sure they were all following the same rules. And you're going to hear that it's the colleges and universities who make these rules. The rules that we're going to be talking about throughout the trial. It's not some folks at the NCAA headquarters in Indianapolis who decide what the rules should be or what powers the NCAA should have. It's ultimately up to the schools. They have the system they want to have. And the system has three basic parts. You heard some about this in counsel's presentation. It starts with NCAA enforcement staff. They're the ones who are supposed to investigate when information comes in about potential rules violations. They're the ones that go and try to figure out what happened. Now, you heard them described, pardon me, but I'm not going to get through this without water. You heard them described as like the police or like prosecutors. But you're going to hear that that's not exactly right. And in particular, you're going to hear that they lack a lot of the powers the police and prosecutors have. So if you're expecting this to be like a crime drama that you watch on TV, you're probably going to be disappointed. Because you'll find that they can't get a search warrant, they can't do wiretaps, they can't even get somebody's bank records. But they try to figure out what happened within the rules that are set up in the system. And that's step one. Then the matter goes to this committee on infractions, if the staff thinks that there's something for the committee to rule on. And this is an important point because everything from that point forward is decided by people who don't work for the NCAA. Under the rules that the colleges and universities create, this committee and another committee after it are composed of people who are not NCAA employees. They don't take direction from the NCAA president. They are members of colleges and universities from around the country and other people who have exposure and knowledge about sports in college. And counsel described them as jurors, but you'll hear them describe themselves. You actually see and hear from most of these people who are involved on this committee and who made decisions about Mr. McNair. So you'll get to judge them, listen to them, and form your own impressions of them and what they were doing and why they did what they did. And you'll hear many things from them, but one thing you'll hear from them is they don't really think of themselves as a jury. And the reason for that is that when we pick a jury, and this is something you guys know because we just did it last week, we try to find people who don't know anything about the case. We try to find people who don't have a lot of links to the topic in question. But these folks in the Committee on Infractions have a lot of links to the college sports. Some of them are conference commissioners, others are prominent professors. They are very knowledgeable about the matters that they hear about. So in that sense, they're a little bit more like judges, like a group of judges who sits to decide a case. And the difference between judges and jurors is that judges are expected to bring that font of subject matter knowledge and apply it to the case. At the same time, they're also expected to review the record and make sure their decisions are based on the record. And you'll hear that that's what this committee did. And then, under the process, that's not the end of it. There's a second independent committee, again made up of volunteers, again a committee that doesn't just take direction from the NCAA. And they have to review the first committee's findings before anyone can get hit with any kind of penalty, any individual or any school. And you'll hear that in a number of cases, these committees have rejected what the NCAA put in front of them and said, sorry, we don't agree. We don't think the evidence is good enough. That's their power. That's their job. I want to tell you a little bit more about this particular committee, the one that heard Mr. McNair's matter and the one that made the findings about it. Counsel had some images for you, and he had some folks in blue. Well, these are the folks in blue. These are the 8 people who made the decision and who issued the report that this case is about. And you'll learn about them through this trial. You'll hear they're from all over the country, and they bring different backgrounds and different perspectives to this work. They all have full-time jobs, but on top of those full-time jobs, they volunteer to sit in this committee because they're not paid anything for doing it. For example, you're going to hear from Eleanor Myers. She's going to come here at some point in the trial. She'll sit here. You'll just get to listen to her and decide what you think. You heard her name mentioned in counsel's opening as being one of the people who was on the fence, one of the people who maybe needed to be persuaded to make a finding against Coach McNair. Well, she'll explain to you, in her own words, why she made that finding. And she'll tell you that it wasn't because of the things that counsel focused on. She'll tell you she wanted to make sure they got it right. She wanted to be fair to Coach McNair. In fact, she had a particular fondness for Coach McNair because she's from Temple, the same place where he was the star football player. She brought nothing into this case in terms of dislike for Coach McNair. But ultimately, when she considered all the information, and when she went back and reviewed what Coach McNair had said, she felt like she just couldn't believe it. You're going to hear from Joe Patuto, another professor from Nebraska. Her testimony will be recorded, but she will explain to you that she had sat on this kind of committee for over 9 years. She had heard dozens, if not hundreds, of matters like this. And she'll explain why she felt the evidence in this case, as to Coach McNair, justified the finding. You're going to hear from Dr. Dennis Thomas. He's another person who is going to come here and talk to you in person. And you know, he's an interesting member of this committee because he used to be a football player. And then he was a football coach. And then he went back to school and got some more degrees and rose up to be a commissioner of a powerful conference in the NCAA. So you'll hear him explain how he would evaluate somebody like Coach McNair, having himself been a coach, having himself been in Coach McNair's shoes. You will hear recorded testimony of Britton Banowski, another conference commissioner, about his reasons. And you'll see in the emails that he was another one of the members who wanted to take it slow in this process, wanted to make sure that Mr. McNair and his arguments were being heard. But he'll ultimately tell you why he agreed with the outcome. You'll hear from Brian Howard, and he's a public member because under the rules, not only do the colleges want conference folks and commissioners and professors there, but they want members of the public also to participate. And he'll explain how he viewed the case. And this group is the group of people who put their names on this report, who made the findings in this case. And they will explain to you why they did that. And they're also going to explain to you another important thing. You see, the emails capture some of what was said, but a lot of these deliberations happened in person or over the phone. They were oral. And these folks can tell you what those discussions were about and how Coach McNair figured into them, who contributed and how much. Now, why do they do it? Why do folks volunteer and spend, we'll hear in some cases 200, 300, 400 hours a year sitting on doing the work of this committee, if they're not paid for it? At the end of the day, what all of them tell you is they believe in the rules. They believe in the mission. And there's two particular rules that are important to this case. One is to protect student athletes from certain kinds of professional and commercial enterprises, and in particular to protect them from agents. Because you're going to find out in this case that agents, a lot of agents who go after college athletes, don't have their best interest in mind. In fact, we can use the agency in this case as an example. You've heard about Lloyd Lake, and I'm going to talk about him. Yeah, he provided Reggie Bush money, and his partner, Michaels, provided a house for Bush's parents. And there was another agent, Mike Sneed, who also provided Bush money. But folks, none of that money was worth having to give back the Heisman Trophy, which is what Reggie Bush had to do when all this came up. They took it. They gave him some money up front, but they never had his best interest at heart. And that's one reason why these rules are in place, to protect someone like Reggie Bush. Yes, a star, yes, a superstar, but also still a very young person from being manipulated and taken advantage of by unscrupulous agents. Another reason the committee members volunteer to do this is because they believe in equity and competition. They believe in a fair playing field. Remember I said the colleges and universities make the rules, and they want the rules to be enforced so that some schools don't have an unfair advantage if their student athletes are getting benefits. Student athletes are not getting in other schools. So, I started by saying that when you hear all the evidence, that evidence will show why Mr. McNair should not win. One basic reason for that is that when the committee issued this report, they got the bottom line. This is the report they wrote. It's going to be numbered Exhibit 61, because sometimes the numbering happens for other reasons, but even though it's number 61, I think it's probably the most important exhibit in this case. And you'll see it has all kinds of findings about USC, about Reggie Bush and the benefits that he and his parents received. There's also findings in there about violations in basketball and tennis at USC, but we're not going to be focused on those in this case. And then there are findings about Coach McNair. Those time on. Now, this report was written by the independent committee, but council told you, and we agree with this, it was published by the NCAA. And that's because the rules required the NCAA to publish all of the reports of the committee. And the rules require that so that all the other schools and all the other coaches can understand what is and isn't against the rules. What will or won't get someone in trouble. And it's important that it's published because this is first and foremost a case about defamation. And Judge Schaller will instruct you that defamation has to be about public statements. What's written in a published report, or what somebody says in a press conference. Defamation is not what you write in a private email to a friend or a colleague. It has to be sent out to the public. Just as important is what is not in this report. It contains some findings about Coach McNair, and we're going to talk about those a lot. But when you see this report, you're going to find out that most of the things counsel focused on in this presentation are not in this report. He talked about getting the date wrong in a call. But if you read this report, they get the dates right for every call. He talked about an investigator making another mistake in the interview, confusing who called who. But in this report, they get it right. What they say lines up with the phone records. And counsel talked some about Mr. McNair and his criminal history related to dogs. Folks, there is nothing about that in this report. Not a word. You will see that, and you can, if you want to in deliberations, you can read it front to back. You just won't see that. This report also doesn't call Coach McNair any bad names. You're not going to see anything of that sort in here. In fact, as you heard, the report doesn't even use his name. Throughout this report, Coach McNair is referred to as the assistant football coach. And they do that for everyone else who's discussed in the report. They mention the school, USC, that much too. But the rest, they don't use names. And the reason for that is that these reports aren't published to make people look bad. They're published so that all of the colleges and universities and all of the coaches who work there have an understanding of where the line is and what line you can't cross. So, what I want to talk to you about are the two basic findings that this committee made about Coach McNair. Because you will see throughout this case that it all boils down to this. They found two things. First, that the assistant football coach, and they're talking about Coach McNair, had knowledge that student athlete 1, that's Reggie Bush, and agency partners A and B, that's Lake and Michaels, likely were engaged in NCAA violations. And 2, that Coach McNair, when he was asked about this, provided false and misleading information. What does that boil down to? Number 1, they found that McNair knew that Bush likely got improper benefits. And number 2, they found that McNair did not tell the truth. Those are the two basic findings. Now, what we will show you is that the committee had evidence to support both of those findings. And we'll discuss that evidence and present it to you over the course of this trial. And we're also going to show you that the committee applied its common sense. Mr. McNair's counsel has used that word, but I'm going to use it too. Because this committee had to decide who to believe. They had one story from Lloyd Lake, they had another story from Todd McNair. And we all agreed those stories don't line up. So they had to decide who to believe. And what you will hear from them is that they used their common sense and looked at which story was more supported by the evidence they had. After you hear that evidence, if you agree that these two basic findings were reasonable, then this case is over. If you agree that these two basic findings were reasonable, then the committee has not done anything to harm Coach McNair. Now, the evidence will also show that Mr. McNair had multiple opportunities to tell his side of the story. And that's where I want to go to this chart. This whole process took more than 5 years. This was not a rush to judgment, and I don't think anyone could argue otherwise. The investigation began in April of 2006. Mr. McNair was interviewed once in September 2006, and he had a chance to answer questions and tell his side of the story. Then more evidence came in. And it raised a lot of questions about what Mr. McNair had said in the first interview. So the investigators talked to him again in February of 2008. They talked to him again, gave him a chance to explain his side of the story, given all the evidence that came in between those two interviews. Then they issued a notice of allegations describing what they thought had happened. But that wasn't the end of the opportunities, because Coach McNair was at this hearing of the committee. So he didn't just tell his story, his side of the story, to investigators. He got to look those committee members in the face, in the eye, in person, and tell them his side of the story at a 3-day hearing. And then when they issued their report, he had another chance because he got to go before the appellate committee. You will also hear that when Mr. McNair fessed up to something, this committee gave him a break. I'll describe this later, but there was one circumstance where he initially gave investigators one story, but then when he came back before the committee, he said, no, that was wrong. And he kind of had to say that because the story ended up not holding together. So he admitted on that one instance that he lied. And if this committee was out to get him, that's all they would have needed to do. But interestingly enough, the evidence will show, and this is not going to be disputed, that when Mr. McNair admitted and fessed up to this one instance, they gave him a break. They rejected a charge that the NCAA investigators had recommended. The only time they made findings against Coach McNair are when he doubled and tripled down on things the committee could not believe. His statements that he didn't know Lloyd Lake and that he didn't have any memory of these phone calls with Lloyd Lake or what was discussed. And on those, he never fessed up. And the committee felt like they had no choice. There's another thing the parties agree about in this case. Mr. McNair and his family have fallen on hard times. You're not going to hear us dispute that. But we will show you that this report is not to blame. And the first thing we will show you, and I just want to make it clear because it's not going to be in dispute, is that the NCAA did not fire Mr. McNair. In fact, you'll find out the NCAA cannot fire a coach. That decision is always up to the school. So it was USC's decision what to do with Coach McNair. And that's just the way the process works. That's not a power that the NCAA has. And you'll also hear that USC did not fire Coach McNair. Instead, you'll find out that his contract was up. It was up in 2010, and when his contract expired, USC decided not to give him a new contract. Now, you have to ask USC why they made that decision, and I don't think we're going to hear from anyone from the school. So this is going to be one of those areas where you're just going to be asked to assume. But nobody's going to tell you that decision was based on this report. And USC decided not to renew the contract while this process was still ongoing. Mr. McNair was still going to go forward to the appeal hearing and the appeal report. And the evidence will also show that this committee gave Mr. McNair one of the lightest penalties they could. You're going to hear that the committee can impose all kinds of different penalties, and they get globbed together under this description of show cause. But I've been on this case for years, and I still don't really understand what that means. So I'm going to just explain the details to you. The committee can give penalties that have different lengths of time. The committee can make different findings. Some findings are a lot worse than others. Sometimes they find that a coach knows about a violation, which is what they found in Mr. McNair's case. Other times they find that a coach is the one providing money or helping kids cheat on tests. Much more serious findings, they were not an issue with Coach McNair, and that nobody suggests that he did anything of that sort. And the committee can include different restrictions. So it can say, for a period of years, you can't coach at all. That can be a restriction. In this case, the penalty that they came up with lasted 1 year. And you're going to hear that as one of the shortest penalties they can give. They give restrictions that last up to 10 years or more. But in Coach McNair's case, they decided 1 year was the right number. And during that 1 year, he was allowed to coach. This penalty did not prevent him from coaching. The only thing it prevented him from doing was engaging in on or off-campus recruiting. So he couldn't go recruit high school kids for that 1 year. Now, we agreed that was an important part of the job at USC, but we looked at his employment contract and it's 20% of his job, to actually lay it out. So for that 1 year, he could do 80% of what he was required to do at USC. And after that 1 year was up, he could do anything he wanted. And ever since this penalty expired, for years and years, there's been nothing in place from the NCAA preventing Coach McNair from coaching or restricting what he could do if he took a coaching job. Instead, the evidence will show that for these past 8 years, Mr. McNair has not done the kinds of things he needed to do to move on with his career. You'll hear that he never hired an agent, that he did not apply broadly. There's hundreds of colleges in the country with hundreds of jobs. He did not send in formal applications. What he did was reach out to 5 or 6 friends and ask if they could help him get it. And you will see that dozens of other coaches have gotten in worse trouble with this committee, with much worse findings and much worse penalties, and yet they've been able to move on and get good work. So that's the basic story we're going to present. As part of that, we're going to have to talk about Reggie Bush, because he is a person that is always present in the background of the case. The evidence will show that Reggie Bush was a star even in high school. Down in San Diego and Helix High, he just stood out for his potential. And then he went to USC, and he got to USC a year before Coach McNair. So he's not one of the guys that Coach McNair recruited. He actually got to USC first. But when he got to USC, he became one of the biggest college football stars in the country. USC won a share of the national championship his first year. USC won an undisputed national championship his second year. USC went undefeated in the regular season in his third year and lost in one of the all-time classic college football games in the championship that year against Texas. And USC was a huge part. Reggie Bush was a huge part of that team. He was an All-American. He was a record setter. And after his third year, he won the Heisman Trophy. And as counsel told you, that is the single highest recognition that a college football player can get. One in the country gets it. And it's something that they get to carry with them with pride for the rest of their lives. Because it's one of the most elite and selective clubs you can ever be a part of. The problem is that after Reggie Bush left USC, troubling reports started to swirl in the media. And reporters were saying that Reggie Bush and his family had gotten benefits. Not just a small amount of benefits, but hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of benefits. And to make a long story short, Lloyd Lake paid Reggie Bush benefits. Bought him a new car, or a actually custom car. That was of a particular vintage. Provided other cash and benefits to him. Michael Michaels was Lloyd Lake's business partner, and he was kind of the financial side of this deal. He had more money, and he used it for various things, including buying a house that Reggie Bush's mother and stepfather moved into and lived in rent-free until this story broke. And what the evidence showed is that Lloyd Lake and Michael Michaels did this because they had a deal with Reggie and with his stepfather. And the deal was this: Lake and Michaels pay the benefits while Reggie's a college student, and when Reggie turns pro, he promises that he's going to go with an agency they were starting. So they were going to get the money from the back end, because once Reggie turned pro, you know, there's some college football players, there's doubt, they're hoping to make it to the NFL, and then there's a handful of surefire ones. And Reggie Bush was surefire. Unless he got some kind of catastrophic injury, there was no way he was not going to be drafted high and playing in the NFL and making lots of money. But the evidence will also show that another agent, another unscrupulous agent, bubbled up. His name was Michael Ornstein, and he started paying Reggie Bush benefits. And so, when it came time for Reggie to declare
turned professional, he went with Ornstein. And he stopped talking to Lake and Michaels after they had paid these hundreds of thousands of dollars. They didn't get what they thought they were getting out of it. And so they started to talk. And they threatened suit, here the there, about all that. So that's the basic story about what happened to Reggie. And it's an easy story for me to tell sitting here today. It's an easy story for me sitting here today, but it took 5 years to tell it. It took 3 years to gather information and another 2 years of these committees. And part of why it took that long is because these investigators are not like police. So here's one of them. Her name is Angie Creeders. She was one of the 2 main NCAA investigators on this case, and she'll be right here sometime tomorrow to start telling you what she found out during the investigation. But in addition to talking about this particular investigation, she's going to talk about the kind of powers they do and don't have. And she will explain to you that these investigators depend on cooperation from the university and its coaches. They just depend on the university and the coaches to tell them the truth. Because, after all, these are rules that are created by the universities themselves. She'll tell you she cannot put a witness under oath. Counsel and I can. We can call them to this witness stand, they've got to swear, and if they don't tell the truth, there's some seriously bad things that can happen. But they don't have that power. They don't have subpoena power. That means they cannot make someone turn over information. So they can't go to the bank and say, we need the bank accounts for Reggie Bush or his parents. Let's just see where this money came from. Take an afternoon. But only if you have that power. And they don't. And outside of the university, outside of current coaches and administrators and current students, they can't make people talk to them at all. There's nothing they can do to make one of these agents tell them what really happened. It's just outside their power. And yet, they're supposed to figure out what happened. And you won't be surprised, I think, to learn that these limitations affected this investigation. Reggie Bush had already moved on to the NFL by the time this was opened up, so he didn't have to talk. Now, he did give a quick interview. He did give an interview. He had his lawyers there, and in that interview, he denied everything. Counsel told you that Reggie Bush denied that McNair knew, but he denied that there were any benefits. He said, I don't know what these guys are talking about. And when investigators asked him to provide the records of where he got all this money, got the car, where his parents got the house, he said, no thanks. Investigators tried to talk to Lamar and Denise Griffin, Reggie Bush's stepfather and mother, and they said, no thanks. Investigators tried to talk to Mike Ornstein, the agent who ended up getting Bush, and one of the guys who paid him the benefits. He said, no thanks. And this is maybe the most interesting part. Michaels was one of these guys, along with Lloyd Lake, got left behind when Reggie went in another direction. And he was going to sue Bush's parents. And instead, they reached a settlement. And as a condition of that settlement, which Reggie Bush was a third-party beneficiary to, Michaels was not allowed to talk to the NCAA. Couldn't go tell him what happened, couldn't turn over any documents. So all of these were dead ends to finding out what happened. But one group of people did cooperate. And that's Lloyd Lake and people associated with it. Now, you've heard a lot about Lloyd Lake from counsel. You heard that he was a convicted felon. You heard him described as a drug dealer, as a gangster. You heard that at some point in this investigation he was back in jail. What you didn't hear is that he provided a lot of documentation. He didn't just tell them what happened. He gathered the records that he had and turned them over. And also, he wasn't knocking on the NCAA's door. You will hear from Ms. Creeder that for 18 months she begged him through his attorneys to talk to them. He wasn't out there trying to help the NCAA, but eventually they got him to agree, and he provided information. And he also, people linked with him provided information. That's his sister, Lisa Lake. She's not a convicted felon. She was actually a pretty prominent newscaster down in San Diego at the time. But she knew about the benefits and she told the NCAA. His mother, Barbara Gardner, also not a convicted felon. She knew about the benefits. She had actually provided like some money which she turned over to Bush, and so she told the NCAA. Lisa Lake's ex-husband, Lemuel Campbell, knew about the benefits, and he told the NCAA. And even Lloyd Lake's ex-girlfriend came in and told the NCAA what she knew about the benefits. And based on this information and based on the records that Lloyd Lake was able to provide, the NCAA was able to figure out the story. Information about the house, about plane trips, information about the car that Lake had bought for Bush, money, hotels. And the evidence was strong enough that even by the time this got, I'm jumping ahead, but by this time this got to the hearing before the committee, even USC agreed that Reggie Bush had been ineligible. Even USC agreed that Reggie Bush was ineligible. So when we're talking about Lloyd Lake in this trial, and whether he's worthy of any kind of belief, I'm going to ask you to keep in mind that without him, there would have been no findings against Bush. This whole story would have gone unknown. But for the fact that the NCAA was able to persuade him after 18 months to tell him what happened. So how do we get from Reggie Bush to Coach McNair? The reason we're even talking about Coach McNair is that the committee wasn't only asked to decide whether Reggie Bush got benefits and whether his parents got benefits. They were also asked to decide whether someone at USC knew. That's part of what they're supposed to investigate. And what the investigator is supposed to investigate and what the committee is supposed to decide. And so what I want to tell you is that the evidence will show the investigators didn't single out Todd McNair. When they went out to USC for the first time, they followed their standard procedures. And they talked to multiple coaches, multiple administrators. This is just on the football side, by the way, 3 football coaches. They also talked to some other ones. Multiple compliance people, multiple student athletes. Coach McNair was just one of several people they talked to. And they talked to him because it's normal practice. You talk to the head coach, you might talk to offensive coordinator, and you talk to the position coach. Reggie Bush was a running back. Coach McNair was the running back coach. So on a roster of over 100 players, the head coach has responsibility for all 100. But the running back coach has responsibility for the 10 or so running backs. So it's normal practice to include that coach if it's the running back that's of concern in the investigation. Now, Coach McNair had a responsibility to Reggie Bush. And it's a responsibility he recognized. I had a chance in that position to ask him about that. Was it part of his role to warn Reggie about agents who might pursue him? He agreed and said yes. And he knew what these agents could be like, because he described them as cockroaches. He said they're an unscrupulous profession. I asked him, they're looking to get in with the players any way they can, and he said yes. And Coach McNair would know better than most because he himself had been in a situation that's a little bit like what Reggie faced. Coach McNair had been an All-American. Coach McNair was trying to make it in the NFL. He wasn't quite the superstar in college that Reggie was, and he would go on to tell me that he knew Reggie was getting worse than what Coach McNair faced. But he knew the issues, and he knew that he had a responsibility to push. And Coach McNair also had a responsibility to the NCAA and to all the colleges and universities. Under the NCAA manual, and we're going to be talking about this document both sides will a lot, all representatives of member institutions, and that includes coaches, shall cooperate fully. And the policies and procedures require their full and complete disclosure of any relevant information, because that's all the investigators have. If the coaches and other school personnel don't tell them what happened, they have no power to figure it out. So what happened in Coach McNair's first interview? September 2006. He was asked by the investigators what kind of relationship he had with Reggie. And he said they had a normal coach-player relationship. Same level of relationship that he had with the other running backs. He was asked how much contact they had outside of the scheduled practices or games. And he said next to none. And media reports at this time were already swirling about Lake and Michaels, and so he was asked about those guys. Investigators asked him, can you tell me if you ever met Michael Michaels? And he said no. Ever met Lloyd Lake? Not to my knowledge. Sounds like you certainly don't recall meeting them. I don't recall ever meeting them. Or speaking with either Lake or Michaels. Never. And here's the interesting part. And it kind of doesn't fit the story you heard from the other side. When the investigators walked out of that interview, they believed Coach McNair. They'll tell you that themselves. Ms. Creeders will tell you that she walked out of that interview thinking, Coach McNair has nothing to do with this. He didn't know, he wasn't in a position to know. Rich Johanningmeyer is the other investigator, and you heard about him earlier, and he did mess up some questions, but he's also a former coach himself. And when he was asked about this, he said we had no reason not to believe Mr. McNair. They walked out of that interview thinking, we checked the box, we talked to the running back coach, he doesn't know anything about this, he wasn't in a position to know, and they were ready to move on from Mr. McNair. And but for the fact that other evidence came in, they would have moved on. There never would have been a hearing about Mr. McNair. There never would have been a report, and there certainly never would have been this lawsuit. All of that happened because after this interview, they got evidence, and it was very different than what Coach McNair had said. So one thing he had told them in the interview, as I just showed you, is that he said he and Reggie had next to no contact outside of practice and games. They looked at the phone records over 15 months, they had over 500 calls. All times of day, night. These records showed a much closer relationship than just seeing someone in practice and in games. They showed the kind of close relationship where maybe Coach McNair was in a position to know about the things that were happening in Reggie Bush's life. You'll actually find out that Coach McNair actually drove around in the car, or at least saw the car that Reggie Bush had gotten from Lloyd Lake. And the evidence also showed that Coach McNair had been in touch with Lloyd Lake. So these are some of the phone calls, and counsel talked about them in one way. I'm going to talk about them in a different way. On October 29th of 2005, Todd McNair calls Lloyd Lake 3 times in short order. That's the evidence that came in. That same night, they're pictured together. That's Todd McNair, that's Lloyd Lake, that's Michael Michaels, Lake's partner, who also paid benefit, and the man in the middle is Faison Love, whom you might recognize from the movies because he's a pretty good comedian. And, interesting fact, he's friends with Todd McNair and he's friends with Lloyd Lake. So what a coincidence. Sorry. No, I want to go backward. On the same night that Coach McNair calls Lloyd Lake 3 times, on that same night, they're pictured together. And then, the records also show, a few months later, January 8th, 2006, Lloyd Lake calls Todd McNair. In the dead middle of night, 1:34 in the morning. And this is exactly at the time where everything is falling apart for Lloyd Lake. Reggie Bush is about to declare pro, and Lake knows that Bush has stopped returning his calls. Doesn't want to talk to him, is acting for all the world like he's going to back out of the deal. And Lloyd Lake, you will see, he's desperate at this point to either get the deal back on somehow or at least get his money back. And in the middle of the night, he calls Todd McNair, and they're on the phone for 2 minutes and 32 seconds. 2 minutes and 32 seconds. I want to give you a sense of how long that is. Let's just try to look at 30 seconds on this clock. I'm going to start now. That's 30 seconds. They talk 5 times that long. In the middle of the night, Todd McNair took a call at 1:34 in the morning, and they stayed on for 5 times that long. So, what did Lloyd Lake have to say about Todd McNair? You heard and you saw some of what he said in the interviews. And again, this is after 18 months of the NCAA trying to get him to agree to an interview. He finally agrees to one. He says, I'm only doing it if nobody from USC is there. Counsel told you that. That's how it went down. But what does he say? First of all, he brings up Todd McNair on his own. Mostly this interview was about Reggie Bush. This is the same one interview where he told him about Reggie Bush. There wasn't a separate Bush interview and an interview about Reggie McNair. So mostly he's talking about Reggie Bush. But he brings up Todd McNair on his own. Investigators don't have to feed him Todd McNair's name. He knows that Coach McNair's nickname is T-Mac. And that is his nickname. And that's what a lot of people referred to him as. Lloyd Lake says that he attended a party in San Diego with Coach McNair. We're going to talk a little bit about that party in this trial, not as much as some of the other events. But we're going to touch on it a little bit. Lloyd Lake says they hung out together at a club and they were photographed together. And that photo that you saw, Lloyd Lake is the one who provided that to the NCAA. And he discusses their phone conversations. So what did he tell the NCAA? The investigators asked him, do you have any did you directly tell T-Mac, Todd McNair, that Reggie was involved with the sports company that you were starting? And Lloyd Lake says, I told him because I wanted him to know that Reggie was involved. So Lloyd Lake says point blank that he told Todd McNair. Investigators follow up, and they're talking about telephone calls, and Lloyd Lake says about Coach McNair, he knew Reggie took money from me. There's no doubt he knew about that. Investigators keep following up. Why do you say that? Because he was around a lot, you know? He watched me get them guys his friends' hotel rooms. Reggie told me he knew about certain things he was doing, but he's cool. And this is an interesting part of the story that Lloyd Lake told the NCAA. Because Lloyd Lake was kind of concerned that Todd McNair would know. Todd McNair's a coach. What if Todd McNair goes tell the school? Then the whole deal might be off. But according to Lloyd Lake, Reggie told him, Coach McNair's cool. Coach McNair, you don't have to worry about it. And then investigators asked about January 8, 2006 in that call at 1:34 in the morning. And this is one of those mistakes. I began by saying the NCAA made some mistakes. There's no question that the investigator made a mistake. He said, January 8, 2006 at 1:34 in the morning, McNair called to you. It wasn't a call from Coach McNair to Lloyd Lake. That night, it was a call from Lloyd Lake to Coach McNair. But Lloyd Lake explains what he remembers, and he said that was like him trying to resolve it, and like Reggie's wrong, he should make it right, and basically don't implement the school. Don't have this affect the school. Figure it out amongst yourselves. Don't implement the school. What can you tell us that you specifically recall about that conversation with him? And he said, telling him about Reggie and all, he knew about the money he took, he knew that he had an agreement. And now, it's true. The investigator got the direction of the call. And Lloyd Lake didn't immediately correct it. Remember, this was also several years later for Lloyd Lake, just like it was for Coach McNair. But just 2 pages later in the interview, Lloyd Lake himself says, I called McNair. He thought it was a couple of times. The phone records show one call. But he said he was trying to get this resolved, just get my money back and make it right. And he even corrects an investigator. His creators asked him, so you called McNair early July and vocalized to him that you wanted your money back? He said, no, January, which is when the call can happen. Correct? Yep. So what did the investigators do at this point? They now had all this evidence that was very different than what Todd McNair said in his first interview. Did they decide to throw the book at him? Did they decide to file a notice of allegations? No. They decided to give him a second chance to explain himself and explain this evidence that had come in. That's why there was a second interview. And before that interview, they had him sign a form that said, if you want, you could have an attorney here. That form mentioned unethical conduct, which is what a finding can be if the investigators think you're not telling the truth. And Coach McNair made a big decision in that second interview. He decided to double down. He said, I don't know and have never talked to Lloyd Lake. Even after the photograph, even after the phone calls, even after Lloyd Lake had said. They show him the photograph and he says, those guys are just hangers-on in the background. It's just me and Faison, and I don't know those two guys in the background. Well, you can look at the photograph and judge for yourself, but I'll remind you that same night he called Lloyd Lake 3 times. What are the odds that somebody's just photobombing you and you called them 3 times that same night. And you might be thinking that I'm just pulling these out of context, but I'm not. Here's what else he said during that second interview. These are all things that Coach McNair said. I don't know Lloyd Lake. I've never spoken to Lloyd Lake. I did not call him. I didn't talk to Lloyd Lake. I didn't see Lloyd Lake. Every way he could, Coach McNair doubled down on having nothing to do with it.
Maybe this would be a good time to take our
Thank you, Your Honor.
Okay, so why don't we